Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
I was saying we had a very English winter.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Very wet.
You had days when you didn't see the sun at all and so on. I mean, it's pretty miserable. And we're not asked, our buildings aren't built for that.
So, no, not at all.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, and this perhaps goes to some of the conversation, our buildings are no longer built for the summer either. So we've got this odd building design that's delivering nothing except, more business to, air conditioner manufacturers.
I think we're live.
I think we are live. I was just going to say something critical about the man who designed Gurugram, but we are live.
You should.
Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of CEW's Parishad on how can India achieve jobs, growth and sustainability. I'm Alina Sen, Senior Communications Specialist at CEW and your host today. It's a great privilege to have with us two of India's eminent leaders and influencers, Dr. Naushad Forbes and Mr. Sukumar Ranganathan. Dr. Forbes is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. He's a chairperson of the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research in Pune and continues to be an active member of the CII. He was its president for 2016-17 and also chaired its national committees on higher education, innovation, technology and international business. Dr. Forbes is a Stanford scholar and has been a consulting professor there between 1987 to 2004. In 2019, the Indian Express recognized him as one of India's 100 most influential leaders. He's a fan of R.K. Lakshman cartoons and an avid reader of P.G. Woodhouse's books. Speaking of books, Dr. Forbes has himself recently written The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential, ideas from which will inform today's discussion. Joining him is Mr. Sukumar Ranganathan, a very well-known and highly regarded journalist. He's the editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times, and under him, this national daily has become a leading voice on sustainability issues. Mr. Ranganathan was one of the founding editors of the Mint in 2006, and its editor for 10 years, from 2008 to 2017. He has also held editorial leadership roles at the Hindu Business Line and Business Today. Mr. Ranganathan is from BITS Pilani, and he's as interested in mathematics as he is in science and technology, business, new media, and data-based political journalism. He reads, of course, collects comic books, and is an amateur birder. To start off the discussion, I invite Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, CEW's founding CEO, an international public policy expert, author, columnist, and institution builder to set the context. Over to you, Arunabha.
Thank you, Alina, and good afternoon and good day to everyone who's joined us today. I will speak very little because I'm here to listen and learn, even as I continue reading Dr. Forbes' book. But my deep gratitude, first and foremost, to Dr. Naushad Forbes and to Mr. Sukumar Ranganathan for agreeing to get into this conversation. But what should the conversation be about? Somewhere in the book, there is a question: can the COVID pandemic trigger a new or prompt a new social contract? And one of those, that word has been, that phrase has been used a lot in recent years. In fact, at CEW, we brought out a report called Jobs, Growth and Sustainability. Can we have a new social contract? But if there is that rethinking of the relationship between citizen and the state, there is also the question about rethinking the relationship between business and the state. And then there's this rethink of the relationship between the present and the future. And I certainly, at least to the parts of the book that I have reached, I certainly see elements of that coming out. But at the same time, even as we engage in these kind of conversations and provocations about a different way of reimagining the world we are in, we are held back like Gulliver with the here and now challenges. The challenges of the fact that we simply are not creating enough jobs, that we simply are not becoming as competitive, especially on the technologies of the future, as fast as we should be doing. That we are simply not creating the mechanisms through which capital can flow to the right people, to the right kinds of businesses at the right pace. So how does Gulliver not give up? And is Gulliver in India just a Lilliputian on the world stage? And how do we then marry the challenges of the here and now while not forgetting that we are trying to collectively work towards a very different future? So those are really the questions that I have in mind, and I don't want to spend any more time in setting this context because there's a lot more of a rich conversation that we will all listen to. But if I could just conclude by arguing that between the struggle and the promise is agency, and whose agency is it that we look towards? Is it political leaders, business leaders, intellectual leaders, or citizen leaders? If we could just stop passing the buck and passing the parcel of someone else's fault, then maybe we would know what that journey between the struggle and the promise could look like. So over to you, Mr. Ranganathan and Dr. Forbes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Shall I go first?
Yes.
So the great advantage of going first is that I get to ask the first question. So thank you, Arnaba, and thank you, CEW, for organizing this conversation today. It's great to be with you. It's always great to do anything connected with CEW, and Sukumar, really good to connect, even if it's only virtually. I love your question, Arunabha, about agency and about whose responsibility is it to see that we move in a particular direction and in the direction that we would all argue is the right direction. And I hope we can come back to that periodically through the conversation, because I think it's a critical point, to say not only what needs to be done, but who needs to do what, and especially what can I do, or what can the institutions that we are ourselves connected with do to improve matters. Let me start with a very broad question for Sukumar. The topic of the session is jobs, growth, and sustainability. And if you look at those three areas, they're our biggest needs, and our needs not just for this year or for the next 5 years, but for the next 30 years. These are the issues that are prime upfront center for India: jobs, growth, sustainability. And as the editor of one of our leading newspapers, and in a sense speaking for media, how do we ensure that we stay as a country and a public clued into these three priorities? Because there's so much constantly trying to take us away from thinking about this. There's some minor war going on. Well, there's sometimes potential of a major war in Europe, and then there's a minor war going on in UP or Punjab or Goa or whichever state happens to be going to the polls. And that tends to divert our minds away from what at the end of the day are these big issues that we need to address. So jobs, growth, sustainability. And I'd love to hear from you on, how do you as media keep coming back to priorities as defined by the media group, but keep coming back to priorities in terms of getting people to engage with the issues that we need to engage with?
Thank you, Naushad. Pleasure connecting with you. And Arunabha, thank you for having us do this. It's always good to do things with CEW. Tough question to start off with, and some of your question had many of the ingredients that make it so tough. The reason why it's so tough, there's just so much that's vying for so much news the way news is defined these days, that's vying for our attention, that it sometimes becomes very, very difficult to prioritize what's important and what's not important. The nature of media itself has also changed. A lot of people get their news through Facebook and Twitter. There are people who stay connected with things through what's happening on Instagram, right? I mean, as unbelievable as it may be, at least to someone in my generation, and I dare say yours also, right? I mean, we're both the same generation, and I think it's important for any media to sort of understand that our primary responsibility is to people, right? And I mean, our primary responsibility is to readers, and readers are a subset of the people of this country, and anything that affects them broadly is something that is worthy of attention. Now the thing is, a lot of people don't really make the linkages as to what affects them, and it's very, very important for media, I think, to make these linkages for them, not from a very I'm standing on a soapbox and I will tell you what you need to do kind of perspective, but more from the perspective of science, data, how it's affecting lives, and really linking all the dots, right? Connecting the dots so that they understand what's happening. And the challenge is, in this day and age, it's very difficult to find the time and the space or the medium for doing that. I'll give you an example. You look at the past year, we've had landslide incidents in Kerala yet again, and we've had huge landslide incidents in Uttarakhand, and yet I did not see too much of an effort by people to actually go back to the original Gadgil report and to see what it actually said about what was happening in the Western Ghats. Because if you read that report and you look at what's happening in Kerala right now, it's frightening, because we knew that this was going to happen, but yet we persisted in doing what we were doing. And I think it's important to make those connections. The same thing in Uttarakhand with the very, very controversial Chardham project that's going on right now, right? And I just think that people don't make these connections. We don't connect science with other issues that need to be looked at. We speak about the climate crisis in a very, very abstract perspective. And when I say we, I mean primarily media, right? I mean, we never try to connect it to real things. But if the world warms up by 2 degrees, Indian agriculture will have to change. We can no longer continue to grow what we are growing, where we are growing. And in a country which is as dependent for agriculture for its jobs right now, I mean, they might not be very well-paying jobs. They might be unproductive jobs, because agriculture per se in this country is not very productive. It's not profitable. It's the reason why we are going to be talking about jobs. But no one bothers to make these linkages. So in our small way, with our small team, we try and make these linkages between science and business and policy, and of course news, what's really happening on the ground, and trying to understand why it's happening the way it's happening. And sometimes the way to get through to people is through data. For instance, we are probably the only newsroom in this country which has a specialist in weather data, who actually looks at it and tries to make sense of, because it's very easy. We just talked about winter. So if you actually can tell readers why January felt so cold in Delhi, and link that to the larger picture of what is happening to climate, it's a lot easier to communicate with people than it otherwise would be. But I think media is as much of a stakeholder in this, Naushad, as businesses. And I think business probably is more powerful when it comes to this than media is, simply because I don't think people read media these days for serious knowledge or perspective. It just it's become a minority. The number of people who read a serious article in Hindustan Times will be exactly the same number of people who spend time on your book, right? I mean,
I hope not for your circulation.
No, but no, because it's not really going to be millions of people who watch, who watch Gangnam Style and say like, oh, great, this is the video to watch kind of thing. It's a much more limited audience. And I think from the perspective of business, because your investments, which you're making today, your decisions that you're making today on how you will grow, on the businesses you will focus on, probably have a much greater impact. Even the kind of raw materials you use, the decisions you take about how localized your supply chain is going to be, or whether it's not going to be localized at all. And now, of course, some of these things are beyond our control, because we know that the manufacturing base for intermediaries in this country is not as great as it should be. So you have to, of course, import a lot of products. But so I'd like to hear from you your perspective of how you think your peers in business are dealing with this. Are they thinking about this? Because I know that all CEOs I meet talk about sustainability. They love to speak about sustainability, but then their companies still, I'm not saying all of them, but some of their companies still misuse groundwater. Some of them who are in the foods business are still not particularly bothered about whether the palm oil that they use is sustainable, environmentally friendly, environmentally friendly palm oil, or the kind of stuff that comes from places like Indonesia, where entire, I once flew to Papua to look at the birds of paradise, and I was shocked at what had happened to those forests, right? I mean, the entire forest had just been replaced with palm oil plantations. So for 10, 15 minutes, we were just flying over an endless range of palm oil plantations. So it'll be interesting for you to share with us how you see business dealing with this.
So thanks, Sukumar. And I'd love to come back to your point about attention spans and what we can do collectively to grow them for people, because I think it's an important point. We will come back to that. I think for business falls in different categories. You have everyone from really committed firms that I think are driven by a lot of passion for sustainability. The chair of CEW is Jamshed Godrej. And Jamshed and the Godrej Group in general are real pioneers when it comes to sustainability practices in their companies and in what they actually fund and what they actually advocate for society and for policy and for the country more widely. So, you have firms like that. You have firms at the other end of the scale that are completely oblivious to sustainability impulses. They're waiting for the rest of the world to move before they do anything. And you have firms that I think are in the middle, which is probably the great bulk of people who think that it's important to do something, are probably clear about a few things that they should do that make sense. For example, energy efficiency, because it pays for itself and so on. And other things that they say they should do because it makes sense from a sustainability perspective, like water conservation, because perhaps they're hit by a particular shortage or crisis in some area or plant or season. And then in other areas where they say, yes, we know we should do something, but we don't know what we should do. And I think you have the full range, really, of experiences. And how do you get more movement in the right direction. And it seems to me there are a few different pieces to it. One piece is you will always have some lead firms that will demonstrate this is what's good to do. So the Godreges of the world. Second, and they act as an example to others. And I think others say, well, if they can do it, why can't we? So you have those lead firms. Second, you have an institutional role. And CEW, I think, is a great example of an institution that's helping further the sustainability agenda for the country and the region more widely, right? Because by it's starting to give, I agree with you that too few people read our reports, but enough influential people read them for it to actually influence policy and influence thinking more widely about the right direction that we should go in as a country. And the right direction from the perspective of what industry should do, what the right direction from the regulation point of view of what standards, etc., should be set, and also some indication of the right direction from the technology perspective. Then what new technology should we invest in, develop, etc., that will help us deal with the kind of transitions we need to make. One of the big things that I've always advocated, our firm is in the energy efficiency business. And one of the things that I've always advocated is high energy prices. Because I say, that listen, you want people to be energy efficient. The best way of ensuring energy efficiency is have high energy prices. Not only have high energy prices, the more you can shock people with high energy prices, the more effective it's going to be. Because if you double the price, but you double it over 3 years with a small change every month, people don't notice. You double it overnight, that really catches everyone's attention. And it might lead to real focus on driving good energy efficiency programs. So one of the areas that CEW advocates this, and I fully subscribe to it, is carbon taxes and the role that carbon taxes can play in our long-term future. And in my book, one of the things that I keep talking about is state capacity, that we have very limited state capacity. Our ability to formulate policy is fine. Our ability to implement it on the ground is limited. And and as such, you want policies that are relatively easy to implement and which can have impact without requiring very widespread, extensive, deep state capacity. And carbon taxes, I think, are such an item, because you can impose it almost as with fiat. It's done, and then the market will sort things out in terms of saying that, okay, if coal is a dirty fuel, it will automatically start pushing consumption away from coal towards cleaner fuels, towards alternate energy systems. It will automatically create an incentive for energy efficiency. It will automatically start creating an incentive for us to develop new technologies that will be more efficient and so on. And I wonder why, everyone keeps, whenever I talk about carbon taxes, everyone says, yes, but they're not feasible. And I always say, but tell me why they're not feasible. I mean, in a sense, we have carbon taxes. We have a tax on petroleum. We have a tax on gas to some extent. We have a modest tax, very modest tax, a fraction on coal. We don't call maybe the coal tax a carbon tax, kind of. The oil taxes and so on are purely from a government revenue perspective, but from the point of view of what effect they have the same effect. They're a carbon tax. And I think, I wondered, what are your thoughts on how one could use a mechanism like carbon taxes to drive industry and consumers in the right direction? It could drive power plants to be much more efficient, to mothball inefficient. One of CEW's recommendations is that, look, we've got all these inefficient
exactly
power plants,
yes,
right? And one of the causes of Delhi's winter pollution is
Yes.
inefficient nearby power plants. So some of those could address many of our objectives if we simply tackle them head on. And one of the ways of prompting that head on tackling is, I think, carbon taxes. I wondered, what are your thoughts on carbon taxes and how we can make carbon taxes politically feasible?
See, I think two aspects to it, right? I mean, the second aspect I will come to later because it's much more difficult. But your point on carbon taxes is very well made, and I agree completely with you. It's probably the way to go, because it will encourage efficiency. It's a market-driven solution, right? I mean, it pushes people into thinking of ways in which they can become more efficient. It pushes people to look for options. And businesses are extremely smart. They will find a way, right? I mean, if big business puts its mind to it, it can pretty much solve any problem. I mean, you look at COVID, for instance. A vaccine had never previously come about in a year, and you had a handful of vaccines which worked well within a year. And the previous record was 4 years for the measles vaccine. I mean, to reduce it by 3 years at a time like this is amazing. So I think carbon taxes will push people to do the right thing. It will spur innovation. I just think, and I'm going to be a little politically incorrect here. I just think that sometimes our policymakers lack the imagination to make things like carbon taxes happen. I think their fear of the outcome is far greater than what it really will be. And I'm going to be even more politically incorrect. I think the political system is also geared to accepting miracle solutions, right? I mean, we are a culture which doesn't take to science very easily. So, if someone gives us a black box and says, you press this button and it will achieve this objective. Let's say the objective is, let's say, the destruction of black money. You're quite happy to press that button. And you don't want to, you think that it will happen because you love black boxes. It's the reason why we love our devices, right? I mean, we all love technology. We hate science, but there's an app for everything, right? Or we want to know whether there's an app for it. And I think carbon taxes are probably not, they don't have the cadence of that miracle solution. So maybe we should do a better job of marketing carbon taxes as a really miracle solution, and it could work. Right?
And maybe we have to market it also relative to the alternative. And sort of say that the alternative of regulation and the alternative of saying that, listen, these are things banning things, and a whole lot of other ways in which one would try to drive the same kind of change.
No, you're very true, because if we don't do this at this point in time, you're right. 15 years from now, we'll have to suddenly ban one of these things or a few of these things, and that would be so much more difficult. And I've seen CEW's recommendation on the older generation and the inefficient power plants. I think that is actually, to my mind, and I really don't know why we're not doing it, because to my mind, that's low-hanging fruit. It's something that we should be doing. Yeah. One, it would be a good thing to do. Two, the optics of it would be phenomenal from the global perspective, right? I mean, imagine you can go and tell the world that I got rid of these. One day they were working, and then the next day we said, no, we don't want these. And we moved away from them. And I don't know why we are giving up those bragging rights.
I agree. I mean, yeah. I think we'll try. I'm going to try to write something on wanted carbon taxes or something like that.
and how they're a miracle solution, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
I think that's really, see, and I, as a follow-up question, because you were speaking about how industry thinks about it. I also, the sense that I get is that sometimes a lot of people assume that the objectives that they're looking at and the multiple objectives they're looking at are contradictory. They probably feel that the ability to manage price of a product and keep it at a certain level, and the kind of materials that they use, right? So there's this clash that happens between growth and sustainability. I just think that, and in some cases, market penetration. Now, in some cases, of course, it's justified, because I just think that sachets, for instance, are enormously environmentally destructive. The plastic might be recyclable, but this, very little plastic actually gets recycled. Much of it doesn't get recycled, it lands up in dumps. And the sachets help fast-moving consumer product companies move their products out, but I think they've ruined the environment in more ways than one. So in some cases, yes, I accept that there's a contradiction, but I think a lot of cases, the thinking in boardrooms seems to start with that contradiction, right? And how do you overcome that contradiction?
One of the I think ways in which you can is actually by agenda setting from a statutory perspective. Now, I am a strong advocate of voluntary board regulations, because it gets companies to think about what the objective is and then how you achieve that objective, and to explain yourself if you don't, as opposed to, here's the statute, and if you violate it, then these are the criminal penalties sometimes, and so on. Because then you, I think, go in excessively for check the box compliance. You comply, but what the spirit is behind the regulation sometimes doesn't get met. You just comply in letter. So I think it's possible to drive some of that by getting it to be more of a discussion point, and where the board asks company management to say what it's doing. How is it thinking about issues of sustainability along a set of metrics? And then saying, and ESG reporting really encourages this. And some companies have taken it, I think, very seriously in the spirit in which it was intended and do a really good job with it. I think many more are starting to get familiar with what's involved. And some of them have been put off by the reporting requirements, but are starting to engage with it. And once you engage with it, and you see it not as a reporting job, but as a actual change on the ground job, and then you report what you've changed, I think it starts building the right kind of momentum. I'm quite hopeful, actually, that we will see some of those changes starting to happen more and more. The one additional thing that I'd bring in is benchmarking within the same industry. I think it's a very powerful way of driving the right kinds of changes. But if you take textile mills, you take paper mills, you take power plants, you take sugar mills, and you say, how do you compare with other sugar mills or paper plants or whatever? What's your energy consumption? What's your water consumption? What's your actual CO2 emission footprint? And you actually start measuring some of these things and you make those transparent. I think it becomes very powerful. And we do this as a company where we, for example, will go to a company that runs breweries, and we compare one brewery with the other brewery for that company, and what's their footprint, what's their energy consumption, etc. And when we first started doing it, what we were told by everyone there was, look, we know that this brewery is good and that one is bad. What we don't know is why. Why is it that this one is so much more efficient than the other one? And actually, when they started learning why, then suddenly we found things improve. So actually, and the improvements were many, many small things, which between them added up to a very substantial improvement. I mean, substantial improvement in some cases, half the specific energy consumption that they were previously at. So you can drive a lot of improvement, I think, by benchmarking within the same industry. And I think we can, as industry, do this in a much more systematic, conscious way. And then I think something like carbon taxes that will simply multiply the incentive to do this quickly, quickly and with more investment.
Yeah, on ESG reporting,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on, does that need a regulatory push or a nudge? Would that help?
I think it would help. And I hope, though, that the way it's done, it's not the way we like to operate, unfortunately, but the way I would like it to operate is as a voluntary standard, saying that, listen, all companies should comply. And I would actually recommend like a 2-3 level thing, saying that, look, here's a minimum standard of reporting, of ESG reporting, which should be very simple and fit on one page. And where you say, this is simple enough for the smallest company to do, right? And you say it's voluntary. We're not saying that what you have to achieve. We're just saying you have to report this, right? And so you report this. It's part of what gets audited, all of that, right? And if you can't meet particular standards, you need to explain why, right? The way that CSR first came in.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then you maybe have a sort of intermediate standard where it starts saying that, listen, this is a little more complicated. You need to set targets. You need to say how you compare with where you were. You need to say how you compare with the industry, etc. And then you have what I would say is the full-fledged current ESG reporting standards that you see internationally. I think we should move in that direction, and where we start off with something that's simple, that can be done by all industry, regardless of size. It's a few minutes of time that it takes that starts giving you a base of data, and then you can start measuring improvement over time. What I hope doesn't happen is the moment you start saying, this is the law, now you have to comply, and if you don't comply, it's a criminal offense, then you'll end up with check the box reporting again.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I wish, this is where organizations like stock exchanges can actually play a much more proactive role. Right?
Yeah.
And all in a positive way. I agree completely with you. It's not going to work by edict. You're not going to say that you have to do this from tomorrow.
Yeah.
But if you do this, right, I mean, maybe we should start thinking along those lines too. I know that exchanges have talked about it in the past. Some of them have stuff on paper, but no one's really followed up in a very serious way.
One of the things that you must have read some of the same reports that I did. That one of the things that's happened is that activist investors have pushed, say, energy companies to sell dirty assets.
Exactly.
And these dirty assets have not been decommissioned. They've not been cleaned up. They've just been sold. And they've been sold to private equity groups, sometimes the same private equity groups that have sustainability funds. They have some other sustainability fund, and then you have another fund that's buying these dirty assets, and then turning them around and making a lot of money on them. To me, this is so alien. I mean, this is just so wrong, and it just seems like you're not achieving anything. You're just moving. In fact, you're moving the asset away from a company that possibly could be pushed to do something about cleaning it up, and of running it better. And I would love, I think in the media, you should publicize those. You should sort of say, here's this sustainability fund sponsored by this particular group, and here's this group buying these dirty assets.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It'll be a fabulous story.
Yeah.
Okay, quick follow-up. A lot of decisions in companies are, at the end of the day, I mean, all decisions are taken by people. How sensitized are today's managers, at every level, starting from the level where they come out from B school to sustainability issues? Because I don't even think B schools are thinking in terms of sustainability, right? I mean, their curricula is yet not expanded to include them in any significant way.
I think they're starting to. I think they're starting to. But to come to on your question on what managers do in companies, I think for anything which has a cost component, they're sensitive to it. So energy efficiency, they're increasingly sensitive. Water conservation, for example, and pure pollution, they're increasingly conscious of pollution from the standards, adhering to standards that exist, because those standards are being more and more effectively enforced. There's still scope to enforce them better, but they are being increasingly enforced, and you see a response from companies. On the water conservation side, I think there's a long way to go. Yes, some companies are starting to get much more conscious of it, but that's a choice that companies have to make for themselves, and too many companies don't. So I think they're, simply starting by asking for reporting, how much water do you consume, is a good start point. And what are you using so much of it for? It would be a good start point, because it would start triggering a review of some of this, and then perhaps we could price water correctly, and that would also have some effect. I wonder if we could talk about a different topic. It's sort of, and it's a topic that I have to say I have no answers on. So it's a good thing for me to ask you. Which is the connection between urbanization and sustainability. If you look at us as a country, 70% of the population is rural. 75 years after independence, that's not a statement of success. The fact that the most of the world is much more urbanized than we are. And I worry sometimes that when we talk about sustainability, we have a sort of
Urban construct in mind.
Yeah, a mental image that rural life is somehow better.
Not in India.
Exactly. I mean, it's better only for those people who live in cities. It's anyone who actually experiences it knows that as soon as they can, they move to a city, right? As soon as they can get a more productive job, occupation, whatever, they will move to a city. So I wonder, how do we think about, if we think about in India 30, 40 years out, that instead of being, let's talk about 1% of the population urbanizing each year. That's a pretty rapid rate. It's much faster than actually experienced. So then say in 30 years time, we'll be, instead of being 1/3 urbanized, we'll be 2/3 urbanized. How do we make that sustainable? How do we make our cities pleasant, enriching, high quality places to live in? And I think there's a big sustainability question there. And also, by the way, a big economic growth question, because this could be a huge trigger for economic growth. Cities, as we know, are much more productive. In India, I think I'm right in saying average urban productivity is 3 times average rural productivity, and so on. So, it's a huge potential growth driver. How do we deal with the sustainability question of, at the end of the day, something like 500 million more people living in our cities?
Yeah, it's an amazing question, and your point on urban and rural is very well made, because in India, a lot of people have these fanciful notions that rural life is more sustainable. It actually is not. Rural life is pretty hard. And unfortunately, in India, urban and rural, the difference is development. I mean, it's not the case in, let's say, Sweden, for instance, where the facilities in rural areas will probably be as effective. They might not be as concentrated, but they'll be as effective as they are in urban areas. Not going to be the case here. I use the Swedish example because of the Stockholm reference at the beginning of the yeah. But we clearly need more cities, and I think it's not just this government. The previous government, if you look at the reason why in the early 2000s, the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, as it was then called, was set up by the Congress. I think it was an interesting and a significant move because it was the first time that political entities were really beginning to speak of urban. Because before that, I think it was political suicide to speak about doing something for cities. Any politician who said, I'm going to focus on a city or I'm going to focus on urban areas would probably lose the next election, as would his party. I just think that we've not followed through well enough on that. I know that the current government has the smart cities, and they have Atal, again focusing on cities. But at the end of the day, if you were to look at it purely in terms of data, and I'm not even looking at it in terms of concentration of capital, but if you look at it in terms of concentration of output, the concentration of output has not changed significantly, right?
Yes.
And it's only when the concentration of output changes significantly that you know that a city is really emerging as a center of business, and this is true even for second-run cities. So whether you take a Kanpur in the north or a Coimbatore in the south, they have hit some steady state plateau, some, I would say, decades, but let me be charitable and say years ago, and they've stayed there. And they're not moving beyond that. And I think it's important to understand what are those triggers or what are those factors that are preventing them from doing that. Because the minute you do that, you encourage people to move from interior UP to Kanpur, right? And you don't have to go to Delhi or Bombay to find work. And so we don't seem to have been able to develop our tier 2 and tier 3 cities very well. And that's most evident in the fact that our tier 1 cities are continuing to grow. So I think the real opportunity here, which probably government should look at, is looking at the success of Gurugram, is to probably just build satellites for every big city. I know they've done it to some extent, but build more and just focus on developing them as separate cities. So in Maharashtra, for instance, Thane and Kalyan, for instance, they just develop them into full-fledged cities.
Yes.
Because we don't treat Gurugram as a satellite. In fact, speaking as an organization, I actually have a separate edition in Gurugram to which I pay a lot more attention than I pay to editions in other states, because I think it's a very, very different kind of city. The same sensibility that works in Delhi is not going to work there. And it's much more of a business hub than Delhi ever was. And so maybe we should do that.
What you're saying about Gurugram is very interesting. I mean, one of the things that has always struck me about Gurugram and also of Noida, by the way, is that they're across state borders. And I think they benefit from being across state borders because in a sense, you have states competing to provide housing, urban housing, living off this wider national capital region agglomeration. So and in a way, that's what Thane and Kalyan suffer from. They're in the same state.
Yeah.
As Mumbai. So you know.
Possible, entirely possible. It's
So
no, it's a wonderful point. It's the reason I think why Sri City came up,
exactly, Sri City
because
would
it,
not exist. I mean, it's living off Chennai, but
yeah,
it's
but it's in Andhra
Pradesh.
Pradesh. Yeah,
So,
superb point.
yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but it is a very valid point. But
And
we have to get our cities right.
so we should really think about, I mean, what is it that we can do in industry, as commercial developers and so on, and how can our urban zoning laws provide for the growth of many of, I think I take your point entirely that, I think our future has to rest in second and third tier cities. I mean, when 500 million people move from rural India to urban India, they can't all live outside Delhi. They need to be spread out across 1,000 cities. We have today, whatever it is, 40 something cities that have 1 million plus population. We need, I would guess, 100 plus. And we need probably many, many, many more cities that have more than 100,000 or 200,000 people. And that grow with some degree of planning. I mean, some degree of this is the city, these are the boundaries, as opposed to the sort of straggly, one house here, one house there, Kacha road here, proper road there.
Correct.
Development that we otherwise see around us.
I have only a very slight difference of opinion. I would be very happy if these 40 became super cities that could sustain a population of 10, 15 million.
Yeah,
right? Because right now what you have is super concentration of what is happening.
Yeah.
And the reason why the US is at the end of the day where it is because it does have some very large cities, but even their smaller cities are at the end of the day centers of business, and they've managed to use clusters reasonably well, which we don't seem to have done, right? I mean, you know the entire work that was done around clustering and competitiveness with Porter and everything else, and you look at the US and you look at those clusters that they've emerged. And in India, for some point in time, it looked like those clusters would actually emerge too. But like many other things in this country, turned out to be a false dawn.
We have some. We have Tirupur for knitwear. We have Morbi, for some of the engineering goods.
Correct.
We have a few, but not enough. Not enough. And in a sense, many of the clusters are actually old craft-based clusters that turned into something newer. As opposed to developing as new clusters in themselves. I agree. I think there's big potential there. I'm mindful that our host asked us a question, and before we run out of time, we should answer his question on agency.
I want you to go first on that.
Okay, so I'll have a shot at it, and then you have the last word. I think it'll have to be to bring about the kind of sustainable future that we want, a sustainable future that creates jobs, that delivers high growth. It's not going to be up to any one agent. There's a clear policy role, and the policy role, I think, the first step in the policy role was fleshed out nicely in Glasgow, I think, by the Prime Minister in terms of saying where we need to be by 2070, where we need to be, and some indication of what the elements would be of getting to zero carbon future. Turning that into the next step is probably then some clarity, some government setting of rules of the game. And the rules of the game would be carbon taxes I would advocate should be a big piece of them. I think the whole, phase out, phase down coal thing should be clearly indicated, even if it causes political opposition. But it should people should know what to expect. At what point in time do we stop building new coal-fired power plants? It's a question that must be answered. Pricing of water and other resources, again, a good thing to do. Then after that, beyond that, what's the role of policy? I think the role of policy then should be large research funding that's available for the higher education sector and perhaps for industry, but definitely for the higher education sector, to create all of that talent, to create people, talent working in all of these areas that we want to progress in, whether it's solar or geothermal or hydrogen or green hydrogen or whatever. Third piece, I think, would be from industry, this whole thing about industrial benchmarking. And I think industry should do that itself. So we shouldn't look to the government. We should look instead to a CEW to do a good study for different industrial sectors and then say, this is how it looks. These are where the gaps is. This is the best. This is the average consumption of water, consumption of energy, etc., etc. And this is what would pay for itself now. This is what would pay for itself if prices were XYZ. And third, I think there's a need to engage widely with NGOs. One of the things that we, I think, really benefit from as a country is that we have a huge number of NGOs. The number I've heard is 3 million. As I've said in my book, that's probably counting everyone's socially committed grandmother. Yeah. But it's a large number anyway. It's the largest number of NGOs in the world, right? And I think the NGOs again have a big role to play in holding business accountable, so that they do the right thing and they do the transparent thing. And if they don't, everyone knows about it. And NGOs also have a role to play in last mile delivery. So last mile delivery on the ground of, how do you get a new sustainable solution to actually work in a village or whatever, right? And I think if we move on these three fronts, we can make substantial progress. But that's sort of my take on Arunaba's question. But look forward to hearing from you, Sukumar.
No, I think everything you said makes a lot of sense. I look at this as in a very slightly different sort of way. At the policy level, I'm not sure we are doing enough thinking on what is likely to happen and what we should be doing. Right? I know Ministry of the Future is a fictional construct, but but we really need a ministry that thinks in terms of that, because I remember once, and I don't want to name the country because it will evoke immediate things of why are we being compared with small countries, large countries, and the usual stuff. But I was once in a conversation, or I was doing pretty much what I do, asking a lot of questions on stage to a man who was number 2 in his government and who'd been told by his country to just focus on the future. So he was looking at what happens when we live till 100, what happens when we can no longer use fossil fuel. And this is a country which had huge strategic reserves of fuel because it felt that, it needed to have that kind of insurance. So you know which country I'm referring to. And what happens when, cryptocurrency replaces sovereign currency. So, some of these questions may be theoretical, but it will be interesting for policymakers to start thinking along those lines. And I'm not sure that we do. One of the things that I've realized is that, and I've realized this from our management of COVID, which in the end we managed it all right, but I just think that we could have managed it so much better with better scientific and administrative leadership. which
Yes.
we clearly did not have, is that having a group of people who are very well qualified, and you spoke about the need for knowledge, who are willing to take in inputs, in this case from entities like CEW, and use them, factor them into their policy making, would be make so much more difference. That's at the policy making level. I just want to quickly finish, because I know we are out of time, is because I see a huge amount of capital headed for the sustainability space, right? Some of it is obviously going to come from climate financing, but a lot of it will also come from private guys who want to get into the climate financing game in some ways, because eventually the market will say, if you're doing that, you get these kind of benefits or these kind of incentives. And so there is this big pile of money that is headed everyone's way. And the third one, which I think needs to be married with these two, is the innovation and the startup engine, where we seem very enamored of startups which are in the fintech space and startups which are in the consumer space. I would like funds to focus sharply on 40 startups which are in the clean energy space, in the sustainability space, right? Arunabha is laughing, right? He's got a smile on his face. But I think if you did that, because there is money to be had in this space, and all you need is a model, all you need is a policy vision. And because I think people, the last aspect of agency is obviously how people think. I think people are beginning to realize that this whole climate thing is going to ruin their lives. At least if you speak to anyone who lives in Delhi anytime between October and January, they will tell you how bad air is ruining their lives. So there is consciousness which was not there before. So I think there is an opportunity to be had if policymakers, capital, and the innovation aspect of it all come together. And I think you can't ask for a better agency than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the conversation very much.
No, so did I. We should do more.
Yeah. Agreed.
No, first of all, I know my colleague Alina will come in to give deliver the formal vote of thanks, but a lot of our own work would get a lot easier if we listen to the two of you and others like the two of you. And I don't say this in a glib way, because I'll say very frankly, at the end of the day, we are nerds, right? And we like data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and keep analyzing it. And then we struggle. How do we take that message in a format and through a medium that then reaches the wider audience? But when you are approaching those questions from a different perspective, it actually helps us to refine what it is that we're trying to get to. And just the last conversation that both of you had, and thanks for addressing the question I had posed up front, is very much at the heart of what it is we're trying to do. We are not only suggesting what should happen, we also want to enable that change. When Sukumar talks about the air quality, we have a schizophrenia of the citizen by night who wants sustainability, becoming the economic agent by day who wants to continue running a polluting diesel genset, because where else is the energy going to come from for them to run their small shop, right? And then who do we blame? Do we blame the policymaker or the enforcers or the regulators or the media, etc.? And it is that lived schizophrenia of all of us that holds us back from agency. Thank you for such a rich conversation, and there's so many takeaways for us. But I will now pass it on to Alina to close it off formally. Thank you again.
Thank you, Arunabha. Dr. Forbes, Mr. Ranganathan, thank you for starting off CW's first fireside chat of the year. It was a huge success. You'd be happy to know that we had over 100 people tuning in from across Zoom as well as other social media handles. So that was a remarkable number of people tuning into the conversation. Thank you very much. For people who attended, Thanks for tuning in and joining us. I'd also like to thank Arunabha and the outreach team for putting this together, this session together. The link of the session will be available on all our social media handles. So do share it forward if you'd like to. Thanks. That's all from all of us. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Arnaba. And bye, Naushad.
Bye.
We'll keep
Bye,
in touch.
Sukumar. Bye. We'll be in touch. Bye. Bye.
Bye.